Hi, so it's March 6th, 2024. I'm going to try and do this all in one take. I've prepared a few notes, so if you see me glancing off at a monitor in this direction, that's what I'm doing, but I really didn't want to run any edits. I'm recording this today because we just got the verdict in the trial of Hannah Gutierrez related to the Rust movie shooting where Helena Hutchins was killed. I began commenting on this case back in December of 2021. So who am I and why should you care what I think? Well, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not law enforcement. I've never worked on a movie set. And I'm not in the movie business. I'm retired, actually, from the IT world. But I consider myself the 13th juror. I watched every minute and every day of this trial. I listened to every available police interview. Some of them made it into evidence in the trial and others didn't. But I have also safely owned and operated firearms for more than 25 years. I purchase commercial ammunition. I also hand load ammunition, so I understand the Colt single action Army revolver very well. I own one. So anyway, let's just go through a little cast of characters for those of you not familiar with this particular trial. Helena Hutchins, she was the cinematographer on the film and she was killed. Joel Souza was the director. He was also shot by the same projectile that killed Helena. Alec Baldwin was a producer and an actor on the movie Rust. He is ultimately the one that fired the shot that killed Helena and injured Joel. Dave Halls was the first assistant director. His name comes up because apparently on a movie set, the first AD is sort of the safety officer. That term is used somewhat loosely, but apparently he is sort of the final check after the armorer on weapons that are used on set. Speaking of the armorer, that's who was on trial today. That was Hannah Gutierrez Reed. There's been some controversy about her name. Her father, Thel Reed, is apparently a really well-known armorer in the movie business. He's almost 80 years old. And apparently her legal name is Hannah Gutierrez, but she started using the Gutierrez Reed for name recognition in the industry. Another name in the case was Sarah Zachary. She was the prop master on the film. In some respects, the armorer falls within the props department, but ultimately at the end of the day, the armorer has final say on all things guns. So, and in this case, the armorer, Hannah, was actually doing double duty. She was working some days in props, some days as an armorer, and I guess it has to do with how she was paid. But in any case, there was a lot of controversy about whether Sarah was Hannah's boss or not. Before I get too far into this, I also just wanted to talk briefly about Helena's injuries. It was graphic, and I'm sorry, there's just no other way to put that, but she was shot with a single round of .45 long Colt. And the bullet entered through her right armpit and it exited between her shoulder blades. It damaged her spinal cord. The bullet went through her lung. There was over 1 liter of blood in her chest. There was a medic on scene that worked for the production, but she really didn't have trauma, a full-blown trauma kit. She didn't have chest seals. And based on the location of the shoot, it took more than 15 minutes from the time 911 was called to get additional medics on scene to provide help. Unfortunately, it was later determined through the autopsy that the initial intubation that was done in the field went into her esophagus, so she wasn't getting oxygen from that intubation. She was re-intubated at the hospital, and they also re-intubated into the esophagus. There were surgical attempts to, get her heart started again, but all of that failed. And quite honestly, from the extent of the injuries and the internal bleeding and the lack of oxygen, there's very little chance she was going to survive. So on the day of the shooting, there had been 7 members of the camera crew that quit. They actually decided to quit the night before, and they showed up that morning to pick up their equipment. One of the concerns and the reasons they quit were over prior safety incidents on set. There had been several, they called them misfires throughout the course of this case, and then some people tried to call them accidental discharges, but truthfully they were negligent discharges. So there had been some prior negligent discharges on the set of Rust, and these camera people walked. So Helena scrambled that morning. She was able to find some other people in the area to come in and sub for the camera crew. They got a late start to filming. They broke for lunch, and after lunch they resumed filming in that church setting, which was a small little indoor building. And there was, ironically, in a world where people have cameras running all the time, and we're on a movie set, you'd think there would be cameras. There is no video. There was no video rolling at the time of the shooting. But what we do have is footage from before lunch when Alec Baldwin was practicing his cross draw of his Colt single action army. And every time he pulled it out of that concealed holster from under his coat, his finger was on the trigger. You may remember that at the time of the incident when it originally happened, Alec Baldwin actually went on TV and claimed he never pulled the trigger, the gun just went off. Well, that claim was completely debunked by the FBI investigation a long time ago. Anybody who knows anything about how these firearms work, that's just not possible. So he's still holding to his claim, but he ultimately cannot absolve himself or pass the blame or shift the liability to someone else. He was the one who had the gun in his hand. He pulled the trigger. Helena died. So let's talk about the real problem real quick. The movie industry is sloppy. They're negligent, and they're not very well informed. They don't really seem to take risk management very seriously or mitigation of risk. It's a fantasy land. It's like dress up and playing make-believe. It lacks a lot of the defined authority and responsibility that you would find in a normal organization of who reports to who. Lack of qualifications. This armorer was young. She had only been the armorer on one prior movie set, and as best anyone can tell, her primary qualification is that her daddy, who was someone who was well respected in the industry, had trained her. But there were no certifications, no written procedures, and generally everybody on this set seemed highly unknowledgeable about guns, gun safety, ammunition components, reloading. It's just amazing to me that this many people can get together with guns around and not have the slightest clue what's going on. And like I said earlier, they mixed up the terms misfire, accidental discharge, and negligent discharge quite a bit. I probably could have led with it, but the verdict now is in. I waited to record this video until after the verdict had been reached. Unlike a lot of the other commentators on the internet, I didn't want to influence anybody with my opinion. But the jury got it right today. They found Hannah Gutierrez guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and they found her not guilty on a tampering with evidence charge. That actually related to a little side story about a handoff of a baggie with some white powder in it, presumably cocaine. But the DA and the police never had possession of that. It was never tested. It was disposed of very quickly, and I didn't see any way they were going to achieve a conviction on the tampering of evidence charge. Reality, she probably did have cocaine. There's a lot of corroborating evidence to that, but without the evidence in hand, there's no point in trying to convict on that charge. But they got the involuntary manslaughter right. You cannot abdicate your responsibility around firearms and say, well, somebody should have given me more time, or the set producers were responsible, or the actor was responsible, or the assistant director was responsible. In reality, what I didn't mention earlier when I introduced Mr. Hall is he took a plea. It was a fairly minor charge in the grand scheme of things. It was a misdemeanor plea, and he got 6 months of probation that was non-monitored. So he has already completed all the requirements of his probation. One of the other people that could have faced charges in this case was Sarah Zachary, the prop master. She admitted to police that not from the gun that Alec Baldwin shot, but from two of the other actors, as she collected those weapons after the shooting and was emptying and clearing them on the prop cart, she threw away those rounds of ammunition that were inside them. Now, in theory, they're dummy rounds, but in theory, so were the rounds in Alec Baldwin's gun. So She took a deal. She didn't have to plead guilty to anything, but she exchanged her testimony and cooperation and promise for truthful testimony on the stand in exchange for an agreement that she would not be prosecuted. So that's another person that could have faced charges, did do some illegal things, but skated by. And of course, next up is the trial of Alec Baldwin. He is also facing an involuntary manslaughter charge. His trial is scheduled for July. We'll wait and let the court play that one out. But I think this sort of sets the stage for a lot of the same evidence we're going to hear when Alec eventually goes to trial. Last thoughts on this. The only reason this industry uses dummy ammo is because during extreme close-up shots, with revolvers in particular, if the camera is close up on the gun, you can see whether or not it's loaded. And so they are purely for appearance sake. They're supposed to be inert, but they need to look like real bullets so that if the camera catches it, the audience will be convinced. That's 99.9% of this problem. What's a dummy? What's a blank? What's a live round? It's confusing, and it leads to problems. And so I think it's time for the industry collectively to agree and for audiences to accept that degree of realism in a close-up shot of a revolver isn't worth the risk. It is not necessary to have dummy rounds. If all we ever had on the set of a movie was blanks look entirely different than live rounds of ammo and dummy rounds because they don't have a projectile. The tip of the bullet, it's not a bullet actually, it's the tip of the case is crimped. It's like a flower petal. I don't have any, I would show you. But it's a flower petal design. There is no projectile at the end of a dummy round. And when you mix and match and you switch from dummy rounds and now you're firing blanks out of the same gun that had dummy rounds, that's what killed Brandon Lee. Go look that one up if you want to understand that a little bit better. But we just need to do away with that. It's blanks or it's nothing. That should be the rule when it comes to guns on movie set. Also a bit surprised that the safe they were storing all of these weapons inside the prop truck, there was a gun safe. It had an electronic keypad, but it wasn't an advanced enough safe to where the keypad had multiple unique user codes or retained any kind of logging that lets you know who got into the safe and when and for what purpose. Those kind of keypads do exist for safes. They're a little more expensive, but they could easily be retrofitted in, and I think that's something the industry should adopt as well. A few other little notes along the way. We heard a lot about an armorer who put ammunition in her pockets. She had a fanny pack and she was loading guns from her fanny pack and pulling bullets out of her pockets. Again, all possible ways to introduce rounds that aren't dummy rounds and could lead to a situation like this. The prop truck and the prop cart were often not secured. The armorer and the prop master both said they weren't responsible for locking up the truck at night. The prop cart would sit out during the lunch hour. The weapons would be put away, but the prop cart would have ammo on it, and no one was watching it, so you don't know what got mixed in while you were away. There was as I mentioned earlier, there was a negligent discharge from the prop master, which was Sarah. There was a negligent discharge by an actor on set prior to the shooting that Alec Baldwin was involved with that killed Helena. And again, I said it before, but I'm going to say it again. Baldwin's claim that he didn't pull the trigger is absolute garbage. I'd use another word, but I'm trying to keep it family friendly. So, and then there was a lot of talk about safety checks and how you perform and check rounds that are loaded into these Colt single action armies, how you do a barrel check. And what they were doing was not sufficient. You cannot, in order to load and unload rounds from a Colt single action army, you have to cock the hammer back to the second position, open the loading gate. You can then spin the cylinder and load and unload one round at a time as you move the position to the loading gate. That's how they were doing safety checks on this set. They would take a gun, load it ahead of time by the armorer, take it into the set, and then the presentation they did was, let me half-cock this gun, move the loading gate open, and I'll cycle through the cylinders. So the only thing they saw were the head stamps on the back of the bullets, on the cases, the cartridges. And so what does that tell you? Well, you're going to see a head stamp. You're going to see a primer that may or may not have been struck. Some of these dummies don't have struck primers. That also makes them confused with a live round. But even anybody who's been around guns will tell you that a round that has a struck primer does not mean that primer has gone off. It is possible to get a light strike on a primer that dents it, but does not detonate it. You cannot visually rely on that. And the other ways that they checked for dummies involved shaking them. Some of them had BBs inside, and you would shake it, and you'd hear a noise. Some of them had a hole drilled inside of the brass cartridge shell. Okay, but you can't see either of those things from viewing a Colt single action Army from the rear with the loading gate open. You will not know any of that. So, improper safety checks. And then anecdotally, there was a lot of evidence through text messages and conversations that the armorer was probably drinking at night, not on set, but at night. There was also a lot of evidence that she was doing drugs, getting high, and the cocaine that I previously mentioned in the tampering charge. None of that affected my opinion, but at the same time, those are really, really bad ideas for somebody who's involved with firearms. Particularly, well, there's some federal issues there, but I think as this case played out in Santa Fe, I think the prosecution did a wonderful job. I know it was a tremendous amount of work getting to this point, to where this trial was put on, and I'm thankful to the prosecutor for the work they did, and to the jurors who sat through this lengthy trial to arrive at a verdict. By the way, it only took them 2.5 hours of deliberation before they had a verdict, which means they were pretty much in lockstep with the same opinions that I came to as the 13th juror watching here from home. So that's it. I realize people will disagree with me, and that's okay. I'm not here to convince you if you think otherwise. But my personal opinion is that this jury got it right, and I thank them for their service. Job well done.